Why have you started mapping out red lines when before the front page of the manifesto would have done as the measure of your priorities in any post-election situation?
Because two reasons, really. I think, firstly, it's become so obvious, if not to Ed Miliband and David Cameron, who are still robotically going around saying they're going to win a majority, that no one's going to win an outright majority. So it's the first election I can remember in my adult political career when everyone knows that no one's going to win before a vote has been cast. And that, I think, has led lots of voters to hold off from making a decision till quite late in the day, which is very sensible, keep us politicians sweating. But it's meant that I think voters quite rightly are demanding, fixed points and clear reassurances about what will be delivered if they vote for this or that party. And that's why I think it is right for me to say, look, we will not go into government if the Conservative and Labour parties impose cuts in the way that they're planning on our education system. We will not go into government unless the £8 billion is provided to the NHS and we boost help for people with mental health problems. We will not go into government unless there are further tax cuts for people on low and middle incomes. We will not go into
spending pledges, though. That sounds like a sort of bias towards...
No, well, you're funny enough, you just interrupted me exactly the point where, which doesn't involve spending pledges, which is to balance the books in a timely way and to do so in a fair way. And actually that includes, for instance, and I'm quite open about it, some tax increases on dividends tax, on capital gains tax, and a number of other measures which only affect the very wealthiest, which make a real material contribution to balancing the books and doing so fairly.
But that's an extraordinary array of policies contained in your existing 4 red lines. I mean, that's practically an entire government
program. If you look at what we've achieved in this government in 5 years, I'm constantly reminded of one policy we were not able to put into practice on tuition fees. But if you look at the fact that 75% of the Liberal Democrat manifesto from the last election made its way into the coalition agreement, and that everything from a massive expansion of apprenticeships, a total liberal overhaul of the pension system, a revolutionary income tax so that no one pays any income tax on the first £10,600 they earn, more money going towards the education of disadvantaged children, childcare, shared parental leave, lunches, healthy lunches for little toddlers at primary school, equal marriage, the list goes on. I mean, that's a much, much longer list than some of the red lines that I'm setting out here. And interestingly, if you look at the other parties, and we've just seen last night, David Cameron basically announced to the nation that the Conservatives and UKIP are now interchangeable. Because while I'm saying that I think the priorities for a lot of people in the country are decent public services, fair tax cuts, finishing the job of balancing the books, putting money into our nurseries and schools and colleges, David Cameron's basically announced the only thing the Conservatives care about is the same thing as Nigel Farage.
But you're willing to bargain that away. That's not going to be a red line
for
you.
What I'm saying to you is while Europe is important, and I'll make further announcements over the weekend about 2 more red lines, let me be very clear. I think I am much more in line with mainstream British public opinion than the Conservatives or UKIP are, but I don't think elevating the internal kind of rancour about Europe in the Conservative Party to the sole purpose in life, which is what David Cameron has declared, represents what people want, whether they are for or against Europe. Above all, they want a government that is stable, that is strong, that is fair, that completes the job of economic recovery, does it fairly, invests in public services, gives tax cuts to people on low and middle incomes. Now, look, other parties need to choose, but since you asked me about my red lines, I just contrast them with other parties, like the Conservatives, who, I think, it's a huge tactical mistake on their behalf, have now basically become interchangeable with Nigel Farage's party in terms of their stated red lines.
With the best will in the world, no forecaster is projecting you to have much over 30 MPs, maybe 40 on a good day. How can that tail wag a much larger party's dog, as it were, in terms of setting the agenda on something like tax, your particular tax priority? If that's not a big party, why would they go with your priority?
If they don't want to, they don't have to agree to it, and then we don't enter into government. It's very simple.
So you're looking forward to minority government going back onto the opposition benches?
No, I challenge other parties to disagree with my view that it is right, because we owe it to the next generation, to balance the books in a timely fashion and to do so fairly. I challenge other leaders to explain to me why they think it's fair to take billions of pounds out of nursery schools or colleges like this. I challenge other parties to spell out, as I've spelt out, our 3-point plan to put £8 billion of extra money into the NHS by the next Parliament. I challenge other parties why they would disagree with my view that having achieved this massive change in the tax system so that no one pays any income tax on the first £10,600 that they earn, why anyone would disagree that we go further and ensure that no one pays any income tax on the first £12,500 they earn. If they disagree with those things and they want to indulge themselves in other things, fine, but the Liberal Democrats will not enter into a government unless it is in line with our instincts, our values and our key priorities.
It doesn't sound like you're equidistant between Labour and Conservatives. It sounds like, for obvious reasons perhaps, that you would prefer a continuation of the current coalition with the Conservatives.
No, I'm entirely equidistant between my dismay at George Osborne's hardline, punitive approach to imposing ideologically inspired cuts on our public services and making the working age poor pick up the tab for the mistakes made by the bankers. I think it's totally unfair, as I am dismayed by Ed Mall's and Ed Miliband's economic illiteracy, who want to carry on borrowing pots of money and failing to apologise for crashing the economy in the first place. I find that if you ask me to choose between unfairness on the one hand and a failure to balance the books on the other, I find it very difficult to choose.
When you consider that you're making a lot of statements now about the legitimacy of various post-election situations. 5 years ago, you made the point about Gordon Brown losing votes, losing seats as a governing party, and basically he had to go. That is highly likely to be your situation. You're a government party. The moment you've lost 2/3 of your vote share, maybe half of the MPs, it's going to be something in that region. What legitimacy will you have to determine what is legitimate in a post-election
No one tells the Liberal Democrats who leads the Liberal Democrats other than Liberal Democrats.
Okay, in deciding whether you go with the biggest party or the second party, do you recognise that's not a constitutional principle?
Well, how can you have a constitutional principle in a country which doesn't have a constitution? I'm just spelling out something flamingly obvious as a politician who's got his ear close to the ground about how people feel. Forget pointy-headed constitutional lawyers. It's just so obvious. If in an election, the British people, they're the boss, not constitutional lawyers.
So you don't accept if the Prime Minister commands the confidence of the House of Commons?
Can I finish my explanation? And I've been entirely consistent about this. The run-up to the last election, at the formation of the coalition, throughout this Parliament, and now the run-up to this election, I just think it is a good, old-fashioned, straightforward, democratic principle that the party that has got the greatest mandate from the British people, the most votes, the most seats, has got more wind in its sails than anybody else, even if it hasn't won an outright majority, would, in the eyes of the British public, and they're the boss, not some constitutional academic, they're the boss, that in the eyes of the British public, they would quite rightly expect that would be the party that could first try and assemble a government. They might choose not to. They might choose not to reach out to other parties might not reciprocate, and other alternative arrangements might need to be arrived at. But call me old-fashioned, but I think in a democracy, surely the party that has got its nose in front of the others, even if it hasn't got an outright majority, has the right to try and assemble a government.
This is very important, though. So to be very clear, there are circumstances in which the leader of a second-place party could be a legitimate Prime Minister if the other options have been exhausted.
But only after the other legitimate option. I think the chronology, the steps you take in a democracy, particularly after an uncertain outcome, are really important to the subsequent legitimacy of any government that is formed. And this is what I think, dare I say it, some of this sort of clever, pointy-headed discussion about all this just misses. You cannot do anything which the British people don't feel goes with the grain of the instructions that they have given to politicians. And if you leapfrog or bypass or try and somehow ignore the outcome in which one party has clearly done better than others, even if it hasn't got a majority, I think you clearly create trouble, because people say, well, hang on a minute, why didn't you let that party try and put a government for... as I say, they may not succeed, and then maybe other alternative arrangements may arise.
But as you know, the point here is that there may be an effort to delegitimise the idea, in any event, forget the sequencing, of a government that's arrived at where the leader of the second-place party becomes Prime Minister.
Well, it certainly will happen if you don't take the steps in the way that I've described. Because people won't understand. Look, the British people are really pragmatic. They really are. They're very smart. They will get that the politicians might have cards dealt with them, which require some grown-up discussion between the parties. And all I'm saying is, I think the British people would expect, respectful of their wishes, as expressed in the ballot box through their votes, that the biggest party, or the party with the biggest mandate, most votes and most seats, has the is given the opportunity to try and assemble a government. They might not succeed, but at least the British people would then accept whatever ensues if first that party's been given a chance to assemble a government. And, you know, I just find that so obvious that I find it remarkable that a lot of sort of, I think, slightly out of touch academic constitutionalists don't see that.
One last question. You must be contemplating this could be your last week in your job.
No, absolutely. Look, I mean, I've said this throughout the election campaign. I will say it in the remaining days. People always write off the Liberal Democrats. We always confound the sceptics. We always confound our critics. We always confound this cottage industry of pessimistic punditry. I'm not being blasé about this. I'm not being silly. Of course, we've got a lot of tough fights on our hands, but we're really good at campaigning. We believe in what we've done. And guess what? We might be the smallest of the three main parties at Westminster, but we're now the only party proudly standing up for the politics of moderation, the politics of centre ground, common sense, decent politics in our country at a time when the right has vacated the centre ground, as David Cameron chases votes to the right, UKIP votes to the right, and as Ed Miliband is being haunted by the spectre of Alex Salmond basically dictating terms. So if you want the country to remain stable, rather than the shambles of the right or the left sort of turning in on themselves, the best way to do that is to vote Liberal Democrat, and I'm very confident that message will bear fruit next week.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Deputy Prime Minister. Appreciate that.